Welcome back, everyone. Today is a professional, and today I'm here with Mrs. Claire. She is an anthropologist and a public health researcher. How are you doing, Mrs. Claire?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on to my channel and talking to you about your career. And let's get straight to the first question. How would you say you initially got into anthropology, and what made you then go into the public health sector as a public health researcher?
I became interested in anthropology when I was a high schooler. And I had this opportunity to do an independent study my senior year. And I just thought it was just so much fun to learn about the world through anthropology because of the ways that anthropologists really show how completely different the world is, um, not just in terms of places, but just even what we understand to be important and how society is organized and what society is and what motivates us every day. It really challenged my understanding of what the world is, but also how we should pursue social impact in the world, because it really challenged a lot of questions and priorities that I had seen within activism as a high schooler, which is something I was really interested in. So I pursued studying anthropology as an undergrad, and then as a graduate student, and a master's and a PhD program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I ended up transitioning to public health, in part because I was really interested in doing more applied research. A lot of anthropological research is really rich and dense and describes different cultural worlds and settings and how life is lived. But a lot of times it's not oriented toward generating change,
Mm-hmm.
in part because there's a real understanding that we need to understand and appreciate cultural difference through this concept of cultural relativism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there's a lot of skepticism, which I think is really appropriate among anthropologists, to say, well, these people in this part of the world need access to medicine. And anthropologists will ask, well, why do they need, what kind of medicine do they need access to? If they need access to Western medicine, is that really appropriate? What are the problems with Western medicine?
Mm-hmm.
What does Western medicine not solve? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it asks lots of critical questions that I think are really helpful. But in part because of that critical orientation, there's less emphasis on, I think, generating applications and solutions to say, yes, things are complicated, but in this setting, if we wanted to decrease suffering or decrease disparities, these are some steps that we could take. So
Mm-hmm.
for that reason, I transitioned into the field of public health, because I was really interested in being able to understand how we could apply our anthropological findings.
Yes. And how would you say what are some skills which are really necessary to be an anthropologist and how they differ from being a public health researcher?
Hmm. Um, So I'd say really at the heart of anthropology is critical thinking. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the way that that is taught is through lots and lots of reading about different cultural settings, but also a lot of engagement with really complex ideas that challenge how we see power and gender and culture. Um, and and gaining those critical thinking uh, skills are really also honed by being in different types of cultural settings. And I don't just mean in different places, but also in different settings within one geographical place that test our assumptions about what things are and could be.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that those are skills that anthropologists have that aren't quite as common in public health. In public health, I think it's very much understood that there are set ways of understanding the world. We have infectious disease, we have community health, we have environmental health, we have public policy. And an anthropologist will ask, well, no, all those things are connected. And
Hmm.
when we slice the world up in that way, what are the kinds of relationships that we don't see?
Right.
Um, what are the problems with the ways that we're thinking through the research questions and what people's health problems are? Um, so um, yeah, I'm trying to think of what else you had in that question. Um,
That's a
I
good.
think, sorry. One other skill that I'd say anthropologists have that's unique from what you see among public health as a broad field is a real deep engagement with qualitative research. So that's interviews and observations and really sustained engagement with communities, whether that
Hmm.
community is stockbrokers or whether that community, is a small town in northeastern California. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and a big part of that skill means noticing connections and really prioritizing what is important to how people understand their own world. Whereas within public health, I think there's much more of an emphasis um, on using data sets that are that are already established, using kind of existing categories through which to understand the world, whether that's disease categories or the types of risks that people are facing.
Hmm. And the way you describe anthropology and public health, we can see some distinct differences. Anthropology is more like open, creative. You could think about it, more critical thinking. While public health is kind of like boxed up. They have a set of rules they use, and they do it to that. So, how would you say anthropology is used in public health, and if is it used a lot in public health?
Yeah, I think that there have always been anthropologists who have been in public health. Um, so there's definitely been a long-term engagement, even though I think it's not always necessarily easy to see them
Hmm.
because, most people don't identify as anthropologists in public health. Um, uh, so, um, and what was the second part of that question? The,
Uh,
the
just some similar. How is anthropology used in public health?
how is it used?
Mhm,
So I'd say a lot of times anthropology is used in public health in order to um, uh, approach, to design approaches to reach particular communities or to reframe problems reframe the scope of research in different ways,
mhm,
or also really to think creatively about what kinds of intervention strategies would be most appropriate for particular communities. So
mhm,
how do you adapt an intervention to address a community's needs? Um, how do you not just adapt an intervention, but really change how you're approaching what the strategy is going to be overall. For instance, I'd say that some public health is focused more historically on education. Let's make
mhm.
people aware of what the risks are and improve their
Right.
behaviors. And anthropologists and other social scientists in public health, I think, have really asked, well, how can we also think about how those individual behaviors of awareness can intersect with the structural factors of changing policies and community behaviors and social relationships.
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah, and what would you say is some good coursework to take if you want to become an anthropologist and some good coursework for a public health researcher? Is there some overlap? And if there is, why would you say so?
Yeah, there's definitely overlap. I would say within anthropology, um, with anthropology and within public health, there is a real attention to the kind of structural level, so big scale picture factors that impact health. So focusing less on individuals, but how do we think about broader patterns that make people more likely to get sick? And how do we create strategies that operate outside of a doctor's office, but in communities and across states and countries and across the world?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, So I would say that kind of focus is something that's common to both of them. So people enter anthropology and public health through different kinds of ways. I mean, I think many people who pursue anthropology end up getting formal training within an academic setting. But I think that a lot of times people who do community-based work, whether in nonprofits or in educational settings, even faith settings, oftentimes have a really great grasp of what the priorities are in communities in ways that really mirror what an anthropological approach is. So that kind of local expertise is very much uh, uh, something that complements anthropological expertise, that is its own form of anthropological expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people also, you see people with, their own grounding in community awareness and health problems, oftentimes also enter public health. I would say the vast majority of folks who enter our Masters of Public Health program um, at our university are folks who've had longstanding experiences working within communities to advocate for health.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say are some responsibilities you have as a public health researcher on a daily basis?
So within a university setting, I'm expected to spend half of my time on research. That means designing my own studies, identifying what are priorities within my own area of research to pursue, and recruiting students to help me carry out those studies. Um, and then doing the actual work of the research itself, whether that means collecting the data and analyzing it, and then really a lot of the time within that research bucket is oriented toward publishing those results and sharing them with the broader scholarly and public community, and applying for large external grant funding through grant applications that will help me to carry out that research in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, about a quarter of my time is spent, well, probably a third of my time is spent on teaching. I teach qualitative methods to public health students, and I also support students who are developing their own independent research projects. And then finally, I spend some time devoting energy to supporting our school and how it runs overall, and then supporting the broader discipline of public health and anthropology by reviewing what other people read, by
Mm-hmm.
reviewing what other people write, and offering suggestions and feedback on whether it should be part of the scholarly record and how.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say are some challenges you face on a daily basis along with these responsibilities?
Um, I would say the primary challenge has to do with that research bucket, in
Mm-hmm.
that um, for many, the vast majority of people who are in public health research,
Mm-hmm.
they have to have external grant funding in order to support not only their research, but oftentimes their salary too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and at this point in time, there is a lot less money that's available to support research, and many people who are seeking that funding. So
Mm-hmm.
that means that you spend a lot of time writing these grant applications, proposing research,
Right.
and it doesn't necessarily yield the funding that you need.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think that can take away from the actual time you spend on research. You're thinking more about what
Right.
research could be rather than
What it
executing itself.
Right, right. Because you might not have the resources to actually finish it just because the grant might go to somebody else.
Yep.
So how often would you say a project might not get enough resources and you might have to like stop it and move on to a different one?
It just totally depends on who you are as a professional. A lot of times your chances of getting grant funding are connected to what institution you're at, whether there's a kind of a key group of people who can put their capacity all together in your research area
Mm-hmm.
to make your grant application stronger. Um, uh, and um, and a lot of it also has to do with what's being funded at the time. There are different
Mm-hmm.
trends in funding. Some areas get hot and some areas aren't, and for good reason. Oftentimes, like it's
Right.
a really great thing that in the last year and a half there was a lot of funding that got pushed toward coronavirus.
Right.
But for those people who didn't do research in that area, it was harder to get funding.
Mm-hmm. Because coronavirus was more of like the major issue, and you had to like pay attention to it, of course.
Right. So as when you do this type of work, you have to be constantly thinking about what your strategy is going to be for grant writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And if you could give us an example of a previous project you have worked on, and if you could tell me like what the details were about that.
Yeah. Would you like to hear about work that I've done in public health or just in anthropology?
Just in anthropology in general.
Okay. So the first anthropology project that I did was I was really interested in understanding health in slum or informal settlement areas, urban areas in India. So I conducted about 14 months of research in one specific community in Delhi. And during that time, I focused a lot on how women themselves living in those communities understood and experienced health and well-being, because that has historically not been part of the focus of how health has been studied in those communities. The
Right.
focus has been more, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how unhealthy are people? Why are they unhealthy? What are
Mm-hmm.
the things that they don't have access to? Um, so much more predetermined, which I think it is important. We need to
Right.
understand, how people are unhealthy. But I think that it also helps just to understand what are the ways in which people who don't have many resources at all,
Try to stay
um,
healthy.
right,
Mm-hmm.
and what is health to them? What is the highest priority? And that a lot of times can explain decisions, and how people frame their lives in a way that focusing on the risks alone cannot.
Right. Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and by focusing on the risks alone, a lot of times we can't understand, well, why is it that a woman who's experiencing domestic violence, why would she not reach out for help? Turns out there's a lot of great reasons why she wouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
that have to do with the fact that oftentimes her main social resource is her family, and that there aren't
Right.
resources that are reliable to reach out for help,
Right.
that reaching out for help can sometimes carry a lot more danger
Right.
than has been understood by researchers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was one of the first studies that I did as an anthropologist, was that time of field work in that community.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. It's very impactful just to learn how you kind of flip the narratives instead of saying, "Oh, how are these people unhealthy?" You're saying, "How do they make themselves healthy?" And it's
Yeah.
kind of like enlightening just because you can see like a different perspective of how things are actually being done, which is, as you said, which is kind of what anthropology is about. And what would you say is the current project you're working on?
One current project that I have is looking at how we can rethink what the mental health workforce is in the rural U.S. So
Mm-hmm.
in rural settings in the U.S., uh, it's really hard to access care for depression. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
times, I think, especially in the last year, we've heard people say, if you need help, go get help,
But they can't find the
go
help.
do it. But that's the thing, is
Mm-hmm.
that in a lot of rural communities and even urban communities, when people seek out help,
They
they
can't.
can't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And that process of not getting help or getting partial help because the institutions are overwhelmed can make people feel even worse. Um, so one of the reasons why they can't get help is because there aren't enough healthcare providers, so psychiatrists, but also physician's assistants, primary care physicians, psychiatric nurses in rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
So this project that we have is looking at how we can potentially expand the capacity of the mental health workforce by shifting certain tasks to community health workers. And community health workers are folks who are from the communities that they serve. They oftentimes provide more linguistically and culturally appropriate care, and asking, well, what kinds of tasks, additional tasks could we give to these workers that would be feasible and appropriate for them?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the steps that we need to take in order to support those workers
Right.
to do this work in a sustainable fashion?
Mm-hmm. And you do you think you have a PhD in anthropology and you also have postdoctoral training in behavioral science from the University of, I'm not gonna say it, but uh, yeah, how do you think that's required to have those to become a public health researcher, or do you think these only help you become a public health researcher?
There's all different ways of becoming a public health researcher. And and also it's really valuable to enter public health with different types of skills. I by myself, there's lots of things that I can't do. I can't look at the scale of a lot of resources or health problems using massive data sets
Mm-hmm.
that many of my colleagues can.
Right.
Um, so I think the real beauty of a lot of public health research is the fact that teams come together of people who have really different skill sets and attempt to communicate across those skill sets and work together. But there's very much this understanding that we can't all do the same thing, and that it's good that we have different types of training, even though that can make it really challenging for us to sometimes talk about what the problem is
Mm-hmm.
and what the best way is to study it,
Right.
and then the best thing is to do about it.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say would you say this is a job where you're constantly learning new things? Because you said you keep on reading new papers about grand issues and stuff like that. So how much on a daily basis do you think you would say you read?
Um, I read really differently now than I used to. I think I definitely, um, I, I don't often sit down to read books
Mm-hmm.
or articles in the same way that I did before. But I would say I probably read for at least 2 hours a day for research, and oftentimes more for maybe an additional hour or two for my teaching when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to reading student papers and
Mm-hmm.
reading things that I've assigned for my classes. Um, but a lot of times when I read now, I'm reading across a field to say, well, what does this literature as a whole say? How can we think on a much larger scale rather than reading one specific paper or one specific book?
Right, right, right. And how would you say the work-life balance is? Would you say that a lot of work has to come home, or do you think that most of the work you're able to do between a set schedule?
I would say that academic work is generally more flexible than many other sectors. That being said, I think that environments where researchers are compelled to bring in grant funding, there can be the work-life balance can be a lot more challenging
Mm-hmm.
because just because you work a certain number of hours doesn't mean that you will earn the funding that you
Right.
need to pay your salary.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right, right. And how can you say that high school students can get involved in this field? What books should they read? What websites should they visit?
um, I would say, the way that I got started was reading books from the University of California Press.
Mm-hmm.
University of California Press has a lot of really great anthropology books. Some of them are not accessible, but many are and really enjoyable to read. So I think just seeing what kinds of books are out there. And I think books are better than articles for getting to know the world of anthropology because it lets you really get immersed in a different cultural world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if that feels interesting or fun to you, then I think it's worth continuing. Um, Another great resource is uh, the AAA is the American Association of Anthropologists. AAA Net, um, I think is their website. And they have a number of different resources on reading lists and blogs, anthropologists' take on what's going on in the news. So that's definitely worth checking out.
Mm-hmm. And one of the final questions, what courses would you recommend high school students to take to gain a comprehensive understanding of this field?
You won't find any anthropology classes in high school usually. Some high schools will offer classes in econ or sociology that can begin to give you a grounding in social science more broadly. But I would just say if folks want to find a way to explore anthropology while they're in high school, you know, when you have the chance to, when you're assigned a paper topic, choose a topic um, that enables you to use anthropological resources.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, choose a topic that's in a different, that focuses on a different approach to a problem than you might have used otherwise. You know, put anthropology of before whatever your topic is, and see what's out there, and see if you can approach a research a paper or project through an anthropological lens.
Mm-hmm. And my last question, I'm going back to like how you could been conducting studies. If you could walk me through like how you organize a study and what the result was. You can use one of the studies you said, or a different study. You can use the one in Delhi, or you can use the one about mental health, or you can use another one. Your choice.
Sure. So for the study on the rural community health workers, um, part of how we came to that study was we were building on some prior research that we had done in Kentucky, that kind of just came out of conversations that community health workers had about the ways that they were able to engage um, with the communities they worked with regarding mental health. And that's really how most research starts,
Mm-hmm.
is some anecdote or some feeling or some idea that comes up from a previous study, and you realize, wow, we really need to pay attention to that in a more systematic way. Um, and as we designed the research, we realized that there's been a lot of work. We went out to see, well, what else has been done on mental health and community health workers in order to get to scope the literature, to review the literature and see what was out there, and to identify what the gaps were that we needed to address within our own research, so that we wouldn't end up doing just the same research as someone else had.
Mm-hmm.
Once we'd had a better sense of what our question was, what the gap was, um, then um, then we went to figure out, okay, who do we want to recruit? Who would be good people to partner with? And we decided to focus on the state of California, just because it was more feasible. And we used the available information to identify different potential participants, and we reached out to those participants, scheduled interviews with those participants, and then once we had all of their transcripts, we analyzed all of the data to see, well, what are the patterns that are coming up? What is happening here? And there was a whole team of students that we recruited and trained to be able to help us with that. To read through all these different interviews and flag the different ideas that were coming up. And then the next stage will be to take those findings and translate them into different reports, some which are community facing and some which will go into scholarly journals.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, those are the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me, Mrs. Claire. If you have any questions, I'll leave my email down below. And Please like and subscribe. We're so close to 1,000. And yeah, peace.